There's a photograph on a wall in a basement in East Tennessee. You'd probably walk right past it if you didn't know to look. It's small, it's in the background. A retired detective named Chris McDana noticed it almost by accident while he was walking through that basement with a woman named Candace, filming for his channel back when this case was still fresh. He pointed at it, asked who it was. "That's my sister that's missing," she said, just like that. Matter of fact, he didn't know that before he walked in. Nobody had told him ahead of time that there was a second missing person connected to this family. And in that moment, you can hear it in the footage, he wanted to ask more, but she didn't want to go there, so he let it go. Filed it away. I want to start there. Not with Summer, not yet. Because I think if you followed this case at all, you already know the outline. The flowers, the basement, the 2 minutes, the search that covered thousands of acres and found nothing. You know that part. What I don't think most people have really sat with is everything that surrounds it. The things that happened after, the things a family said publicly that don't quite line up with what the paperwork actually says. And that photograph, because it turns out that's not a small detail. It's not a coincidence either, even though officials say the two things aren't connected. It's just true, and it's strange enough that I think it deserves more than a passing mention. So that's what this is. I'm not going to walk you through the whole timeline again, minute by minute, the way it's been done a dozen times. If you know this case, you know the shape of it. What I want to do instead is pull on a few threads that I don't think got the attention they deserved. And one of them, the biggest one honestly, is about her brothers. 3 boys who lived in that house, who were taken out of it about a month after Summer disappeared, and who, 5 years later, still aren't home. There's a version of that story the public has heard, and there's a version that's actually in the paperwork. They don't match. And I think that gap is worth talking about, honestly, without turning it into something it isn't. Let's go back for a second to who this family is, because I think context matters here more than usual. Summer Wells was 5 years old on June 15, 2021, when she disappeared from her home in the Beach Creek community of Hawkins County, Tennessee. Blonde hair, blue eyes, this really wide open smile. You've probably seen the photo. It's been everywhere for 5 years now. According to her mother, Candace Bly, they'd been outside planting flowers near her grandmother's camper on the property. Summer went back toward the house. Her mother says she asked her 3 older brothers, who were inside watching TV, to keep an eye on her. Within 2 minutes, that's the mother's own account, she went to check. Summer was gone. No sign of forced entry, no confirmed sighting since. An Amber Alert that's technically still active 5 years later, which, if you think about that for a second, is its own strange kind of fact. Alerts like that are built for the first hours, the first days. 5 years is not what that system was designed for. Now, I mentioned the photograph. Here's what that actually is. Candace Bly has a sister. Her name is Rose Marie Bly. And in August of 2009, 12 years before Summer disappeared, Rose Marie left her home in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin, telling her husband she was headed out to meet a cousin at a bar about 5 miles away. She never got there. Her car turned up 5 days later, abandoned in a parking lot in Grantsburg, Wisconsin, the kind of lot truckers use to park their rigs overnight. 30 miles from where she'd been headed, she has never been found. The case is still open with the Polk County Sheriff's Office in Wisconsin. They've said publicly more than once that they've never stopped working it. I want to be really careful here, because I think this is exactly the kind of detail that gets misused in true crime content. It's easy to hear 2 women from the same family, both vanished without a trace, and let your mind run straight to some dark conclusion. I'm not going to do that. Investigators in both states have said, on the record, that they don't believe the cases are connected. Different states, 12 years apart, no shared evidence, no shared suspect, nothing that ties them together beyond the family name. But I also don't think you just skip past it, because it is true, it happened, and I think it tells you something. Not about what happened to Summer, but about what this family has actually been carrying, quietly for over a decade, before any of us ever heard the name Summer Wells. Candace Bly's mother has now lost 2 family members to unexplained disappearances, her daughter and her granddaughter. That's not speculation. That's just the shape of this family's history, confirmed by two separate law enforcement agencies in two separate states. Okay? Let's get to the part I actually want to spend the most time on, because I think it's the part almost nobody's really sat with. About a month after Summer disappeared, late July of 2021, the Tennessee Department of Children's Services removed her three brothers from the home. They were 12, 9, and 7 years old at the time. No public reason was given. None still has been, officially, because under Tennessee law, cases involving minors in the child welfare system are sealed. That's not this family being secretive. That's just how the law works for any family in any state in a situation like this. Don Wells, Summer's father, spoke to a local paper around that time. He said, and I'm going to be honest with you about how strange this quote is, "It's probably better for them right now with everybody attacking us." Sit with that phrasing for a second. Not DCS took them for a reason we disagree with. Not this is unjust. Just, it's probably better for them right now. That's an odd thing to say about your own children being removed from your home. Now here's where it gets complicated. And I want to walk through this slowly because the timeline actually matters. For years, 2021, 2022, 2023, the boys stayed in state custody. The family didn't confirm much publicly. Don Wells, at different points, declined to say whether they were in foster care or with relatives. In 2023, in a blog post on the family's own website, the parents wrote that the state of Tennessee has the three boys, and used some pretty strong language. At one point calling it, in their words, DCS having kidnapped our boys. They said they weren't being allowed contact. Then in 2024, according to reporting from the Rogersville Review, a local Tennessee paper that has covered this case closely for years, Don Wells and Candace Bly signed over their parental rights to the three boys. I want to just say that plainly, because it's easy to blur past a phrase like that. Signing over parental rights isn't the same as a case getting dismissed. It isn't the same as a judge saying these allegations aren't true. It's a specific permanent legal action, the parents giving up their legal status as parents. In most states, that's the step that comes right before a child becomes eligible for adoption by someone else. And then, this is the part where the story the public heard and the story in the paperwork start to pull apart. In June of 2025, Don Wells posted a video and a statement online. He said, and this is a direct quote from that post, "Our DCS case has been dismissed. All opinions of abuse or neglect are dropped and unsubstantiated by judge order. According to Tennessee DCS, we have not abused or neglected our three sons." He shared what he described as documents supporting that. Now, here's the thing. The Rogersville Review, reporting on this directly, wrote something I think is really important to sit with. They noted that the Wellses had reportedly signed over parental rights back in 2024. And then they wrote, about Don Wells's claim of being cleared, I'm quoting the paper directly, "This is not public information and cannot be confirmed." So you have two different things being said, close together in time, and they don't obviously fit. One is a documented legal action, giving up parental rights, reported by a local paper with no reason to make it up. The other is a public claim, made by the father himself, that the underlying allegations were found to be false and the case was closed in the family's favor. Both of those things could theoretically be technically true at once. A family can sign over rights for all sorts of reasons, including ones that have nothing to do with guilt. Overwhelmed families do this. Families who feel like they'll never get their kids back through the system sometimes make that call just to give the kids stability somewhere else. I'm not going to sit here and tell you which explanation is the real one, because I don't know, and this is the important part. Nobody outside that sealed case file actually knows either. Not me. Not the people who cover this case for a living. Not the commenters online who've built entire theories around it. What I can tell you, honestly, is that a well-respected local paper looked at the public claim and said it couldn't be verified. That's not nothing. That's a journalist on the record saying the version the public was given doesn't match what's actually confirmable. I think that gap between what was said and what can be proven is the real story here. Not because it tells us anything definitive about Summer. It might not. It might have nothing to do with her disappearance at all. But it tells you something about how this family has managed information publicly for 5 years. And in a case with this much uncertainty, that pattern matters. Let's talk about the house itself for a minute, because I think the physical layout actually explains a lot of why this case has been so hard to make sense of from the outside. Chris McDonough, the retired homicide detective I mentioned at the start, spent time walking through that property early in the investigation, with Candace's permission, trying to understand the geography of what she was describing. And what he found, in his words, was something close to what he called a dungeon-like environment. Not in a sensational way, just structurally. The entrance to the basement, where Summer's bedroom was, wasn't a normal doorway. It was a narrow opening, maybe 18 to 24 inches wide, more like a hatch than a door, tucked under a countertop. He described having to duck and turn sideways to get through it, even though he's not a particularly large man. Once you were down there, he said the lighting was minimal. Sheets of reflective aluminum on parts of the walls, blocking out most of what natural light there might have been. A mattress on the floor on one side, bunk beds and toys on the other. He described it as dim enough that in the second room, it was close to pitch black except for the glow of a television. I want to be careful with how I frame this, because I don't think it's fair or accurate to turn a family's living conditions into shock content. Poverty is not evidence of guilt. Plenty of families live in difficult, cramped, imperfect homes and are loving, safe places for kids to grow up. That's true, and it's worth saying clearly. What McDonough was doing in his walkthrough wasn't judging the family's income. He was trying to understand something more specific, the physical mechanics of how a 5-year-old could vanish from a space like that in the middle of the day without anyone hearing or seeing anything. And that's where his analysis gets interesting, because he actually pushes back against the most common theory that a stranger snuck onto the property and grabbed her. His reasoning was pretty methodical. For an outside abductor to pull this off, they'd have needed to know, with real precision, the exact moment Summer went down into that basement. A piece of information that, as he put it, you'd basically need an ability to see through walls to know in advance. They'd also have needed to know that the basement door was unlocked or have a key to it, because, and this detail matters, the only other way into that space was through the narrow hatch inside the house itself. And whoever did it would have had to do all of this in a location with a work crew present down the hill that day, doing tree trimming or power line work, adding witnesses and risk to an already narrow window. Based on all of that, McDonough said publicly, on camera, that he personally ruled out a random stranger abduction, not because it's technically impossible, but because he considered the risk and coordination required too high to be likely. He laid out instead 3 broader categories he thought were more plausible: some kind of accident followed by panic and concealment, involvement by someone the family actually knew, or a scenario connected to conditions inside the home itself. I want to underline something here because it's important. Those are his professional opinions based on a walkthrough he conducted years ago. They are not findings from TBI. They are not conclusions the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office has confirmed. Investigators have never publicly ruled out a stranger abduction, and they've also never confirmed any of McDonough's specific theories. This is one experienced investigator's read of a scene, offered as analysis, not as established fact. I think it's valuable to hear because he's someone with real expertise and he was actually there. But it's still exactly that. One person's professional opinion, not a verdict. There's one more thing from that walkthrough I think is worth mentioning, because it's small and it's the kind of detail that's easy to miss but hard to unnotice once you have. At one point, standing near the basement door, Candace told him she didn't remember whether that door had been locked or unlocked on the day Summer disappeared. McDonough pointed out, and you can hear this directly in his own recorded commentary, that he hadn't actually asked her that question yet. She volunteered it, brought it up on her own before he'd gotten there. Now, I want to be fair about what that does and doesn't mean. People volunteer information for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with guilt. Grief does strange things to how people talk. Trauma makes people repeat details obsessively, sometimes offering up the same fact over and over because it's the thing their mind keeps circling back to, not because they're hiding something. I'm not going to tell you this proves anything, because it doesn't, but McDana, watching it happen in real time, said it struck him as notable enough to bring up on camera, unprompted. And I think that's worth including, with all of that context attached, rather than leaving it out entirely. Let's talk briefly about the family's history before any of this happened, because it's public record and it does add real context, even if it doesn't answer the central question. Don Wells has a criminal history that includes felony convictions tied to drug offenses and burglary across 3 states, Arkansas, Utah, and Texas, going back to the late 1990s and early 2000s. Candace Bly has a misdemeanor domestic abuse conviction from Wisconsin from 2003. And in April of 2021, about 2 months before Summer disappeared, Candace filed for an order of protection against Don. In her own written statement to the court, she said, and this is her language, not mine, "He drinks and throws things. I am afraid of being hurt. He is abusive physically and mentally toward me. I am afraid for my children and myself." That order was granted. And then less than a week later, she had it dropped. The couple appears to have reconciled shortly after. I want to sit with that timeline for a second because I think it's easy to read past it too quickly. 2 months before their daughter vanishes, the mother is telling a judge, in writing under penalty of law, that she's afraid of being hurt and afraid for her children. And then, within days, that fear, at least on paper, is withdrawn. That doesn't prove anything happened to Summer. Domestic situations are complicated, and plenty of protective orders get dropped for reasons that have nothing to do with the underlying fear disappearing. Financial dependence, fear of retaliation, family pressure, wanting to keep a household intact for other children. I'm not going to pretend I know which of those, if any, applies here, but it is documented, it is public record, and it is part of the environment Summer was living in during the final weeks before she disappeared. I think leaving it out would actually be less honest than including it carefully. There's also Don Wells' adult son from an earlier relationship, a man with the same first and last name, technically a junior, who has a conviction for child sex crimes in Utah and is a registered sex offender there. I want to be extremely precise about this because it's exactly the kind of detail that gets distorted online into something it isn't. That son did not live at or near the Tennessee property. Investigators confirmed he was in Utah at the time Summer disappeared. He has not been named as a person of interest in her case. I'm including this only because it's already public record and because leaving it out entirely, while other channels whisper about it without context, seems worse than stating clearly what is and isn't established. What's established is he exists, he has that record, and he had an alibi, confirmed by investigators, placing him somewhere else entirely. Now, the piece that ties a lot of this back together, and the reason I mentioned it earlier, McDana, near the end of his walkthrough commentary, made a comparison that I think is worth including because it's the kind of observation that reframes how you think about a case like this. He said, roughly, 5-year-olds do not typically disappear out of the basement of their own home. It just doesn't happen, statistically. And then he added something that stopped me when I first heard it. It's like Nancy Guthrie. 84-year-old women don't disappear out of their own bedrooms either. This is the exact same type of scenario. Just change the age. I think that's a genuinely interesting frame, even though the two cases are, on the surface, completely different. Different states, different decades of the person's life, different circumstances entirely. What connects them, in his view, isn't the who, it's the where. Both are cases where someone vanished from inside spaces that are supposed to be the safest place a person has. Their own bedroom, their own basement, under circumstances that don't fit the pattern of a random stranger just happening by. In both cases, investigators have had to seriously consider the uncomfortable possibility that whoever was involved wasn't a stranger at all, but someone with legitimate reason to already be there, or already be trusted enough to get close. That doesn't mean the cases are connected. They're not. There's no evidence linking them in any way, and no investigator involved in either case has suggested otherwise. It's simply a pattern, a recurring, uncomfortable shape that keeps showing up in cases like this. One that experienced investigators have learned to take seriously rather than dismiss. So where does all of this actually leave us? 5 years later. Summer Wells is still missing. She turned 10 this past February. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation released an age progression photo earlier this year, trying to show the public what she might look like now, because the little girl in that original photo everyone knows, the one with the wide smile, isn't a 5-year-old anymore, even if that's the image frozen in most people's minds. TBI Director David Rausch gave a statement at the 5-year mark that I think was honest in a way officials don't always allow themselves to be. He said, "We never imagined her case would remain unsolved 5 years later." Her 3 brothers are, as far as any public record shows, still not living with Don Wells and Candace Bly. Whether they're with relatives in another family entirely or somewhere else isn't something that's been confirmed publicly because, again, the law protects that information for minors, regardless of how much public interest there is in this case. And there's still that photograph on that wall of a woman who left her house in Wisconsin 16 years ago now and never came home either. None of these threads on their own tells you what happened to Summer Wells. I want to be honest about that because I think it would be irresponsible to pretend otherwise, just to give this a tidier ending. The DCS situation with her brothers might have nothing to do with her disappearance at all. Plenty of families end up in the child welfare system for reasons completely separate from a missing child case. And correlation here is not the same as causation. The order of protection might reflect a difficult marriage that had nothing to do with what happened months later. Rose Marie Bly's disappearance, by every official account, is its own separate tragedy, unconnected to Summer's. But taken together, what you have is a family that has for 5 years given the public one version of events: that Summer was taken by a stranger, that the family has been fully cleared of any wrongdoing regarding their sons, that there's nothing more to the story than a tragic, random crime, while the actual documented record shows something more complicated. A protective order filed and dropped within days. Parental rights signed away, not restored. A public claim of being cleared that a local newspaper, on the record, says it cannot confirm. I don't think any of that answers the question everyone actually wants answered. I don't think it's supposed to. What it does is show you why, 5 years in, with over 500 tips, hundreds of searchers, and thousands of acres covered, investigators still don't have the answer either. Because the story as it's been told publicly and the story as it's documented in the paperwork have never quite matched up. And when that gap exists in a case this serious, for this long, it tends to stay open. Not because nobody's looking, because the people looking keep running into the same wall the rest of us do. A family that says one thing and a record that says something else, and no way from the outside to know for certain which one is telling you the truth. Somewhere, a woman who's now 10 years old, if she's alive, doesn't know any of this is being said about her family. Somewhere, 3 brothers who were 12, 9, and 7 when they lost their sister and then lost their parents too, in a different but related way, are living lives none of us can see into. And somewhere in Wisconsin, a case file from 2009 sits open about a woman who left home to meet her cousin at a bar and simply never arrived. A case that has nothing to do with Summer, according to every investigator who's looked at it, and yet somehow still sits in the same family's history, waiting the same way Summer's case is waiting for someone to finally say something they haven't said yet.